on your daily walk toward heaven. And so to start our study today, I want to revisit an episode actually that I spoke on not too long ago, not too terribly long ago. Actually, it was when we first went into quarantine, the very first lesson that we video recorded to be put online had to do with this episode from Bible Ministry. And I'm thinking of the account in Acts chapter 16, where we read about the conversion of the Philippian jailer. We're going to look again at that account this morning, at least to start things off we are. But we're going to take note of something that we didn't take note of before, and it quite often doesn't seem to be taken very great note of, at least in sermons that I've heard. Something that almost seems to be mentioned in passing as Luke records the events of that night. So I invite you to be turning there in your Bibles to the book of Acts, the 5th book of the New Testament, and the 16th chapter. This is where we read this account that has prompted these thoughts that I want to share with you today. Now, if you're familiar with Paul and Silas' experience at Philippi, you know that it was really overall not a very good one. They weren't treated very well at Philippi. That's kind of putting it mildly, really. Paul, even I thought, put it kind of mildly when he wrote to the Thessalonian brethren in 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 2, and he said there that we were spitefully treated there, or shamefully treated there by the officials of that city. All of this primarily because Paul had cast a spirit of divination out of a young girl that was there in Philippi. The problem being that there had been some men in Philippi that had been using this young girl and the gift that she had as a result of her having the spirit to make money. And so when Paul cast out the spirit of divination, he did something, boy, you're really not supposed to do. You took away these men's means of making an income. Didn't matter if it was legitimate or not, people don't like it when you take away their ability to make money. And so Paul and Silas find themselves in the inner prison of Philippi with their feet locked up in stocks. But beginning at that point in the account, we're going to begin reading around verse 25. We read there, but at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were loosed. And the keeper of the prison, awakening from sleep, and seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. But Paul called with a loud voice, saying, "Do yourself no harm, for we are all here." Then he called for a light, ran in, and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. And he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And of course, from there you continue reading, and you see what took place as this man became a Christian, as he was cleansed of his sins and saved. And that's what we normally do take note of, is the things involved in his salvation that night. And that is an excellent account to look at, to see what one must do to be saved. That's all that is involved. But again, as I said a moment ago, there is something that is mentioned in this text that we just read, and it almost seemed to be mentioned in passing, that I have long taken note of. I've just never spoken on it before, but it's probably what I would like to say this morning. As we noted, Paul and Silas were not treated well at Philippi. They were beaten with rods. Then they were thrown into this prison and locked up. Their feet were locked up. So this is a very bad situation for them. They're thrown in the inner prison. And the narrative that we read from just now picked up in the 25th verse. But notice what Paul and Silas are doing after all that they've been through at Philippi, what they are doing in their jail cell at midnight. They are praying and singing hymns to God. They are worshiping God after all that they've been through that day. And that's not what I want to take note of. What I want to take note of is what's written next in the text. Paul and Silas, after all that they've been through, are worshiping their God. Meanwhile, what does verse 25 say that the other prisoners were doing? They were listening to Paul and Silas. Some translations render this as the other prisoners heard them. That's not as good a translation, quite frankly. Listening is a better translation. You hear something, you can hear something without paying attention to it. I mean, I mentioned that from up here before, that there's a lot of people in this world whose hearing is fine, but their listening is not so good. And the term that Luke uses note of what they were hearing coming out of that inner cell. What these men of God were saying as they awaited whatever it was that was going to happen to them next in this prison where they found themselves. I have entitled this morning's lesson, "Is anyone listening?" And that question in this context is intended to be rhetorical. Yes is the answer to the question. The message that I want to get across this morning is that people are listening to every one of us. People are listening to us. And what they hear as they listen to us, and I suppose what they see as they watch, I guess you could say, when we talk about listening, is anyone observing us? Because they are. And what they see and what they hear from us as we carry out our day-to-day life, whether we like it or not, can have a direct bearing on their spiritual faith. Think about the narrative that we just read from. It does seem that what these other prisoners heard out of Paul and Silas had an impact on their behavior and on what they did and what they did not do when that earthquake came, remember? Because think about it. If you were a prisoner in a place like that, and you think about what prisons would have been like in that region and in that time, and you had the opportunity to get out, what are you probably going to do? You're going to get out. Nothing you'd like more than to leave. But as we read a moment ago, Paul and Silas prayed and sang, an earthquake hit that shook the foundations of the jail. All the doors were open. Everyone's chains fell off of them. That's why the jailer was about to kill himself. He made what was probably a pretty reasonable assumption. They're gone. He's going to kill himself because he just assumed that the prisoners, all the prisoners that he was responsible for, had escaped. But of course, then in verse 28, Paul calls out in a loud voice and lets them know, we are all here. The other prisoners didn't leave when they had a chance. Is it possible that there's a connection between this fact and the fact that these other prisoners had been listening intently to Paul and Silas prior to the earthquake? I don't mind telling you, I feel pretty confident that there probably was a link there. Being where they were in the prison, in the inner prison as it's described, I don't know how aware or how conscious Paul and Silas were of the fact that they were being listened to. But whether they were aware of it or not, we know that they were being listened to. We know that people were listening to them and paying attention to what they heard. And I believe that is something that every Christian, everybody in this room, everybody that professes Christianity needs to be reminded of, made aware of, that others are watching us and they're listening to us, whether we are aware of it at all times or not. Be it our kids, that's a lesson I had to learn when I became a father, and I think a lot of other fathers did too. Be it our kids, be it our neighbors, our co-workers, people are listening. They are observing, and often they are doing so intently, especially to those of us who make a profession of discipleship after Jesus. They may be listening to how we deal with difficulties that come up in our life and adversities. And such times do come, and quite frankly, I think we can say, especially for the Christians, are these times will come. In Acts chapter 14, in verse 22, as Paul and Barnabas were strengthening the disciples in Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, they told those brethren, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. To Timothy, young preacher Timothy, in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, Paul wrote there that all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. That's just how it is in this life and in this world with faithful disciples of Christ. But even beyond that, see, that's just what Christians do on top of all the normal stuff. Because beyond that, every human faces difficulties in this life. How many times have I said it from up here? I got problems, you got problems, they got problems, all God's children got problems. That's just something that every human faces at different times in life. And we who are Christians deal with those same difficulties as everyone else. In may suffer as a result of our faith. What about talking about problems with family? Talking about problems with finances, problems with the house, problems with the car, whatever. There's no shortage of crises that any person may have to deal with as part of life on planet Earth. And oftentimes, you've seen this, I've seen it, we've talked about it before. Oftentimes, when difficulties arise, especially some of the more painful ones, what will people often do? What's the first thing they will do? Who's the first person they will often blame? They will shake their fist in anger at God Himself and voice displeasure with Him. And I'm not just talking about people who are not Christians either. I'm talking about many Christians that I've observed as well. I mentioned to you before about the person that I consider to be a friend, fellow Christian, active in the church at one time. But when that person's spouse left them for another, it was God's fault in their life. And they verbalized that, and they expressed it, and made no secret of this thought on their part. And they were through with the Lord from that day forward. They haven't been back since, as far as I know. What I had not mentioned before is that that person had a sibling whose faith was fragile at best. Well, guess what? When that person blamed God and left the Lord, their sibling wasn't far behind. People, not just siblings, but just people in general, are listening to what we have to say about our God and our faith at all times. And there may be no better time to demonstrate the genuineness or the phoniness of our faith than when we are dealing with tough times. I remember a man whose wife wanted him to lash out at God. Remember that? In the book of Job, Job lost everything. And I mean, I can't overestimate that word, everything. His possessions and his children. And then his health. Well, guess who else lost everything? Well, maybe except for their health. His wife did. Well, we know how she reacted to that. She told Job, do you still hold your integrity? Curse God and die. Doesn't that kind of suggest that maybe she was blaming God too? That was exactly what her intent was? But remember how Job responded in Job chapter 2 and verse 10? Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? Now we know it wasn't God that brought this adversity upon Job. You know who did not know that? Job did not know that. You read through the book of Job, there's no indication that Job was ever made privy to what was going on. But nevertheless, he would not blame God. He acknowledged that, I never questioned God when things were going good for me. Why would I question Him now? The Lord is real. The things that we believe about Christianity are real. They are based in fact. Then it may be that someone who knows us may only be able to see the reality of these things when they see the reality and the consistency of our faith in these things at all times, both good and ill, even in the most difficult of days. Be mindful of what you have to say about the Lord and the faith in Him in difficult times. People are listening. They will take note of it, to be sure. Not only that, we also need to be mindful about what we say about the church at all times. People listen to what we have to say about that as well. I'm talking about the church that we affiliate ourselves with, the people that we worship with. What do your friends hear from you about the church? What do your family members hear? I have wondered sometimes how many people through the years, friends of Christians, never developed an interest in the church because of what they were hearing about the church from their friends who were Christians. I wondered how many children grew up with no interest in the church and who left the church at the first opportunity in no small part because of what they heard Mama and Daddy and other people that they knew saying about the church and about their brothers and sisters. background, thanks in no small part to my parents, thanks in no small part to the good brothers and sisters who counteracted the influence of certain others on me, I chose to remain with the Lord's people and be active among them. But there are so many people, both outside and inside the church, whose attitude toward the Lord and His people is going to be severely and adversely affected by this kind of talk. And of course, that can have a severe and adverse effect on the church itself. Sometimes before we start speaking of our brethren at all, maybe we would do well to remember some of the things that we're told that we ought to feel toward our brethren in the New Testament. How that, for example, Paul in Romans chapter 12 and verse 10 says, "Be kindly affectionate to one another, with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another." Now, if I've really got that attitude in my heart, how likely is it that I'm going to be bad-mouthing the brethren and the brotherhood to those on the outside? Regarding this affection that we're to have for one another, the love that we're to have for one another, you remember what Jesus said in John 13 about it? He said, that's how people are going to know that you're my disciples. By the love that you have for one another. Are people seeing that love when we talk disparagingly about the church, about members of the church? This has the potential to do great harm to a church. It has great potential, probably greater potential to do great harm to the individual who is discouraged from becoming a part of the church when they hear such talk. You remember what Paul wrote to the Ephesian brethren in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29? In Ephesians 4 and 29, we actually mentioned this in another lesson a few weeks ago while we were still in quarantine. If you watched the YouTube lesson, you probably heard me refer to this. But in Ephesians 4 and 29, Paul writes there, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." Now, oftentimes we read this verse and we think, well, Paul's telling us to watch our language, don't use vulgar, profane language. That's included, yes. But what Paul's saying encompasses much, much more than that. The term that he uses there, no corrupt word, that literally has reference to something that is worthless or rotten. Rotten and worthless words. Not useful. Words that don't do anyone any good. It includes the kind of things that we're talking about here. How is bad-mouthing our family? That's what we are here. To outsiders, a good thing. How is that ever a good thing? By the way, notice in this verse what type of speech that this corrupt communication is contrasted with. It is contrasted with that which is good for necessary edification. Because what you need to be doing is saying things that build people up, build the church up. You don't dare say anything that tears people down in the way that we're talking about here. Is what I have to say about the church, particularly in the presence of outsiders, is it helping to build up the church? Or am I speaking worthless words that serve to harm the church, as well as one who is discouraged from being in the church by what I say? I know, we all know, that this church, just like every other church, just like every other family, is comprised of, bless our hearts, human beings. Fallible, imperfect human beings. And let me tell you something, just like any other family that we might be a part of, there's going to be conflicts and problems that arise among these fallible human beings from time to time. But when you've got a conflict in the family, do you go blabbing about it to the whole world? There's some things that we don't need to be sharing with the whole world. Since when do we feel the need to share all the issues that are present within the family? And besides, at the end of the day, shouldn't we still love the family? We know our flaws, we know our faults, we know our flaws, and we still love one another. Isn't that the way it's supposed to be? I know we've got issues. Every one of us does. But we work through it as a family. That's the way it's supposed to be. I should never take from this fact
speaking ill of the Lord's people. People hear that kind of talk, and as I've already noted, it may well keep some of them from wanting to be a part of anything like that. When they hear me complaining and griping, they're going, you want me to come to church to that place with you after all that you said? I don't think so. And it could result in them being left out of heaven at the end. We need to take this seriously. Why can't I let folks know that I love these people that I worship with, and I treasure my relationship with them more than anything in the world? Don't disparage the church. Be a cheerleader for it. I am more than happy when I'm out among people to let them know how much I love my church family. That's what they need to be hearing from us. They know we're humans. Let's let them know what kind of special humans that we worship with and how much we love one another. People listen to this kind of talk as well, and we need to take note of that. And another thing that we can take note of in this regard is the fact that people are listening when we talk about or react to sin that we are exposed to. What I'm talking about here particularly is the tendency on the part of some, by what they say, to downplay the seriousness of sin. Maybe to excuse ourselves for something inappropriate that we might say, or justify ourselves as we talk about something that we may have watched or listened to that we really knew it would be better if we hadn't. I remember years ago, brother in Christ, somebody I love dearly, but I remember him talking about a movie that he watched. And it was general knowledge that this movie contained some material that was just really not good. And his brother was aware of that, and he acknowledged that as he talked about watching this movie. But you know what he said? He said, yeah, I know it's got that stuff in there, but that stuff doesn't bother me. I assume he meant it didn't affect him, which I seriously doubt. I know that it didn't bother him. I already knew that it didn't bother him. That was already evident to me by virtue of the fact that he willingly watched it, knowing what was in this movie. And he told people he was watching it. I could see that it didn't bother him. And that bothered me. Because as a Christian, it should have bothered him. Now, I'm going to be honest and forthright about this too, though. I have to acknowledge that I know I have taken the same attitude at times. Watching things, shows, and movies, they should have bothered me more than they did. Maybe I've talked about how I enjoy those movies and other shows. I like a good comedy. If a show makes me laugh, I'm going to have to really fight to overcome the temptation to go along with it if it's doing something wrong. But maybe I'm aware of something like that, or maybe I'm aware of something that someone did that wasn't right, and I try to excuse it. Maybe I hear about a personal friend, or maybe something in the news that I heard about a celebrity, and maybe my reaction to hearing about it is that I make light of it. Or that I downplay it and indicate that I just don't take this as seriously, sin as seriously as I should have. People on the outside who need to be cleansed of their sins are listening. Are they hearing from us that sin really isn't as big of a deal, as big of a problem that needs to be fixed as it really is? Is that the impression they're getting? I'm afraid, where I'm concerned, probably in times past, that has been the case. God forbid that should be the case again. Because sin is a big deal. It is a serious problem. It is an offense against God Himself. And what a slap in the face it must feel like Him when we, His people, downplay its seriousness. Lot, the person Lot, Abraham's nephew Lot, despite some bad decisions he made as far as where he wanted to live, he is nevertheless described in the New Testament as a righteous man. He was a righteous man. And in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7, Peter notes there that righteous Lot was oppressed or vexed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. Lot was oppressed by the Lot distressed to see the wickedness going on around him. And I don't get the impression that he ever tried to downplay it, that he ever tried to excuse it. What we see going on around us in society, does what we see coming into our homes through the television set, is it causing us distress? Do we laugh at the funny gay guy? Or the clumsy drunk? What are people taking away from what they hear out of us in response to sin? You know, the people, not only was Lot bothered by the sin of people around him, you look at the account of Lot's time in Sodom, and what you find is the people who knew Lot knew that their sin bothered him. They knew where Lot stood with regard to their behavior. In Genesis chapter 19, this is where we read about the angels coming to visit Lot, and then the men of Sodom coming to Lot's house, demanding to be given the men of Sodom. But if you look at Genesis chapter 19, and verse 9, take note of what these men say about Lot as they describe how he has been since he's coming among them. They say, well, then they said, this one, talking about Lot, this one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. He comes in among us, he's different, he doesn't like us, and he acts as a judge over us. Apparently Lot had already spoken out on the sin that was going on around him. We see him speaking out against it on this night. But apparently this wasn't the first time. And they just say he keeps acting as a judge. He didn't laugh it off. And so what did the people of Sodom say? They said what many people say today when we take a stand against sin. You're judging me. He keeps acting as a judge. You have no right to judge me. You have no right to do that. Well, actually, the righteous have not only a right, but an obligation to speak out against sin, to do what Lot did. The fact is, Lot wasn't imposing his own will upon them. He wasn't imposing his own judgment upon them. He was just trying to make them aware of what God has said about such conduct. I think of the psalmist's words in Psalm 119 and the 13th verse. The psalmist there says, with my lips I have declared all the judgments of your mouth. He's talking to the Lord. Yeah, I've spoken judgments, but they've been the judgments that have come from God, not my own. This is what Jesus was talking about when he said, judge with righteous judgment. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah could have been helped if they had listened to Lot, because he did not downplay the seriousness of what they were doing. Are people helped when they hear and see how we react to sin? Are they made more aware of how sin is so very, very destructive? In Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 15, we are told that the way of the transgressor is hard. Sin is not to be taken lightly. It destroys life. Sin destroys nations and societies. Look at Rome. Look at the United States. Proverbs 14 and 34. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Sin is bad. Nothing but bad. And we who are Christians should be aware of that more than anyone. How bad is sin? We should know this. How bad is sin? Look at Calvary to see how bad sin is. Where the only truly and completely innocent man who ever lived was brutally tortured and killed. And as you look at Jesus in your mind's eye, hanging on that cross, covered in blood, writhing in pain, tell yourself this: sin did that. Sin should not be made fun of. And when people listen to us, is there any reason for them to doubt how we feel about it? We need to remember that we who hate what sin does need to let it be known that we hate what sin does. People listen to it, and they take note of how we react to such. How we react to sin. But there's one more thing I it does to others. We all should. But we all should also remember that we are to hate what sin does to its victims because we love those who are its victims. Most of us have heard the saying, hate the sin, love the sinner. And that is indeed how it should be. There's a tendency, I'm afraid, sometimes, if we're not careful, we see people do this sometimes, a tendency to conflate the sin with the sinner. And thus view the sinner as some kind of enemy. Listen, the sinner is not our enemy. Aren't we all sinners? The sinner is not our enemy. He is the victim of our enemy. We need to know that, and he or she needs to know that we know that. It was interesting to me thinking about what God had to say to Cain. He was born. He killed his brother. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, God told Cain that sin was lying at the door, and its desire is for you. God didn't conflate Cain with sin. He made a distinction between sin and the sinner. The person who is aware that he or she is a sinner should know that when they are among us, they are among friends that want to help them. But I'm afraid that oftentimes when we hear of and talk about some person that we're aware of, maybe a celebrity in the news, or maybe somebody we know personally who has been caught in sin, whatever the sin might be, I'm afraid sometimes as we talk about it in such a way that only makes clear how disgusted we are to hear such. I can't believe they did that. We'll talk about how terrible that person is for doing that. And how that they should just be so ashamed of what they're doing. And I would certainly never do that. I wouldn't associate myself with that kind of thing. You ever think that maybe the person that we're talking to, or maybe another person that just happens to be listening to us, might be struggling with sin themselves? Maybe the very sin that we're talking about? Maybe they are ashamed. They need help. Is what they have heard out of us going to encourage them to seek help from us or others like us, or drive them further away? In Luke chapter 7, we read of a woman that came to Jesus while he was eating at the house of a Pharisee. Most of you are probably familiar with this account. She came in and she washed his feet with her tears. She wiped his feet with her hair, and then she poured precious ointment on his feet after that. And the Pharisee who was hosting Jesus that day looked at all this, and it seems that he was kind of disgusted with it all. And someone said, if this man was a prophet, he would know that she is a sinner that was did this to him. Pharisee called the woman a sinner. He was right about that, by the way. I mean, first of all, I know because she's a human. But also, consider what Luke writes in Luke chapter 7 and verse 37. There, Luke, the inspired writer, says, behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner. When she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of oil, and stood at his feet behind him weeping. Luke writes that she was a sinner. Yeah, she was a sinner. But apart from Jesus, how did that make her different from anyone else in that house? And take note of this. Take note of how the Pharisee reacts to this woman coming into his home. And take note of how Jesus reacts to the woman. And take note of who it was that she went to for help when she came into the home. Take note of who it was that she went to, who she went to receive forgiveness and salvation. Somehow, maybe through earlier interaction with him, maybe by watching him, maybe by listening to him, but somehow this woman knew Jesus was accessible to people like her. Now understand, Jesus never once tried to downplay the seriousness of any sin. Remember our last one. Jesus never did that. On more than one occasion, we're reading Jesus telling someone, go and sin no more. He never downplayed the seriousness of sin. But it was clear to those who knew him and those who listened to him that they could come to him for help with their sin if that's what they desired. Matthew verse 12. When Jesus heard that, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Jesus didn't downplay the seriousness of sin, but if somebody wanted help with their sins, it was clear that he was accessible to them. Shouldn't we be as accessible as he was? Regardless of what sins it is that we're talking about or who these sins have been committed against, are people hearing from us that they can come to us for help if they truly desire it? When people hear us, are they encouraged to come clean and seek help, or are they made to think that it would be better just not to expose themselves to such ridicule? Personally, I don't know what serious sin is, but I want any person who's caught up in any sin to know that if they want forgiveness and they want help and deliverance from whatever their sin is, that they've got a friend right here. That they've got friends right here that are more than happy to help them. I want them to know that at this place and among these people, they are among friends. But what they hear out of each one of us is going to go a long way in determining whether they too feel that way. Let's do our part in this regard and be aware. People are listening with regard to this as well. We should be mindful of those around us. And what they are hearing from us regarding such